The Intel Core i7-9700k is one of those incredibly popular chips like the Q6600, i7-2600k, 4790k, and 8700k that have come before it. With a rather beefy 8-core Skylake-derived design, this chip was the first consumer-level i7 to sport this many cores, and despite it also being the first one to cut the hyperthreading feature, it was still incredibly popular back in the day for both gaming and content creation machines. Let's take a look back at the 9700K, and see if it's worth even considering for a modern gaming-focused system. In some ways, it's still an absolute champ, but in others, it's starting to have a few hiccups. Before we get into this video, I'd like to say not to forget to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see additional hardware review videos. I've got a couple graphics card videos planned for the next couple of months, and your feedback now can help when writing these new videos. Additionally, if there's anything you think I missed with the 9700K, don't hesitate to let me know below, as I can't cover every single aspect of a CPU and its architecture in the course of a single video. With that out of the way, let's dive into what we'll be using to test this chip, and then see how it holds up in a mixture of newer and more popular classic titles. To house the 9700K, I've got an Asus Prime Z370A LGA 1151V2 motherboard. This board was previously used with a 9700K before it ended up in my hands, so the BIOS update was already completed. Even though I do own both a Z370A Pro and Z390A Pro board that would be compatible, this one has superior power delivery and an additional M.2 NVMe socket, giving more expandability when testing. This board also ran the 32GB of 3200 megatransfer per second DDR4 that I have perfectly fine, where I couldn't say the same for the MSI Z370 or Z390A Pros. The faster memory will definitely help the 9700K in CPU-bound scenarios, but what will really help is the more beefy power delivery, allowing this chip to max out at over 200 watts at times. As a result, I'm having to use a 280mm Corsair AIO to tame the thermals, but even so, the die on this chip just runs warm at the 5GHz we've got the chip clocked at. I'm talking high 80s and mid to low 90s on a couple cores. Definitely not something I would be comfortable with long term, but for the short term testing, it never throttled clocks or had any blue screens. For the GPU, we've got a Gigabyte WindForce OC RTX 4070, which is certainly not the fastest GPU on the block, but is more than powerful enough to max out the 9700K at the resolutions and settings that we're testing at. Additional system specs will be in the description should you wish to replicate anything you see in this video. With the test specs out of the way, let's dive into the performance of the 9700K. It surprised me in a lot of ways, but also raised some questions at times. Starting off with the slightly strange first benchmark for this channel, Battlefront 2 from 2017. And despite this game having excellent graphics still to this day, it's pretty lightweight on the CPU, which surprised me considering newer Frostbite engine games typically run most comfortably across at least 12 threads. The title was tested in a DirectX 12 mode and at a low preset at a 1080p render resolution to prevent GPU bottlenecks. The engine framerate limit was reached a majority of the time, coming in with a 199 FPS average and a 119 FPS 1% low. I mainly tested this game because it's seen a resurgence in the past couple of months, and it also serves as a nice representative title for what we probably would have tested on this chip back when it first released. I don't have any complaints about how this game runs on the 9700K, and there was absolutely zero stutter that I could either feel or notice. Older Frostbite games are a treat on this particular processor, and other titles built on similar engine builds, I'm thinking Battlefield 1 and 5, also play pretty smoothly and without much of the stuttering you'd experience on 2042. Up next is Black Ops 6, the latest in the COD series built on a modified IW 8.0 engine. At the basic preset with DLSS set to balanced at 1080p, the game performed well considering this chip released 6 years prior to its release. Achieving an average of 176 and a 1% low of 127, the 9700K was very smooth, and for all intents and purposes I wouldn't have a problem playing this game on this hardware.
If you're looking at picking up this chip, then it's really hard to complain about if you're coming from an older quad-core Skylake design or even older like Haswell or Sandy or Ivy Bridge. And I suspect this game runs so well on a straight 8-core 8-thread setup because that's what's been optimized for in both the Xbox One and PS4 family of hardware. So having cores with much higher IPC than Jaguar allows the engine to both parallelize and perform computations more quickly. Would I build an entire system around the 9700K if I'm looking to play Black Ops 6? Potentially if it's a hand-me-down processor, but if you're building from scratch, then a newer and similarly spec'd i5-12400 would easily outperform the 9700K, and you'd still be able to use similarly priced DDR4.
Cyberpunk 2077 is a now older but once again popular game thanks to its re-release on the Switch 2. It is built using the custom Red engine on DirectX 12. And although we're testing at the medium preset without an ERT and with DLSS set to balanced, the game was still pretty heavy on both the GPU and CPU at a 1080p final render resolution. Coming in with a 131 FPS average and an 87 FPS 1% low, the 9700K was 100% the bottleneck in the system, but it's now performing a little bit better than what I remember with this same game a year or two back when I last took a look at Skylake chips. I suspect a lot of it has to do with both using a more powerful GPU and also software optimizations made as CD Projekt Red is still, as of recently, providing graphical updates primarily for additional upscaling technologies. Once again, like Black Ops 6, I probably wouldn't buy an entirely new system around the 9700K, as the CPU bottleneck with more powerful modern GPU starts to become kind of extreme. But if you're getting this chip secondhand as an upgrade, then the 8 physical cores still perform very competently in this heavy and beautiful looking title. Up next is the Unreal Engine 5 flagship title, and despite us running at the lowest preset without Lumen or Nanite, but once again with DLSS set to balanced at 1080p, Fortnite ran excellently and would be very competitively viable with some stuttering at times. With an average of 230 FPS, things look impressive, but the 1% low of 74 was definitely some noticeable slowdown when playing on a 180Hz display. At the same time though, if you're rocking a 60Hz monitor, you definitely wouldn't notice this. I just think it's worth mentioning that the game does have some areas of CPU related slowdown though. Fortnite seems to be another one of those games that really likes having 6 cores and 12 threads. And although it still performs well on the 8 straight cores that we've got here, the extra threads on a lower core count chip would provide some benefits in the 1% low, even if the average ends up being similar. From a console player's perspective, this performance is incredible, and it makes me comfortable recommending the 9700K for a Fortnite focused system, even if I'm willing to admit that there are better options on the market that are similarly priced. The next game we'll be testing isn't super popular, but it's another Unreal Engine 5 title that seems to be more lightweight than Fortnite. Fragpunk, a small team first-person shooter with an interesting but weird card system, performed better than other Unreal Engine titles tested, both on average and especially the 1% low. At the low preset at 1080p, this title achieved an average of 303 and a 1% low of 205 FPS. Showing that the 9700K still has the skills to pay the bills when software is appropriately optimized. I'm willing to admit that this game's graphics and art style aren't super photorealistic, and at times look more similar to something like Marvel Rivals or Fortnite, but it plays in its favor as it's not that demanding on either the CPU or GPU. This behaves more like Call of Duty or Counter-Strike, in the sense that you're playing on pretty simple, smaller maps without kilometers of draw distance or hundreds of enemy players and AI, in the end allowing your system to push out more frames. This title runs well on the 9700K, and it's definitely worth checking out if you've got one or are planning on picking one up. GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, the most recent update to the still incredibly popular game, received brand new graphics options and effects, an upgrade to DirectX 12, and performance fixes that plagued the game considering it's now 12 years old and relatively cheap hardware could push out 188 FPS without any sort of trouble. While the Enhanced Edition is certainly more heavyweight than the older vanilla versions, considering we're testing at the high RT preset at 1080p, you'd think that we'd be more limited by the 4070 in this system, but we're actually maxing out a couple cores on the 9700K. With an average and 1% low of 124 and 70 FPS respectively, turning on ray tracing puts an additional load on both the CPU and GPU. But with a weaker, less parallel CPU, we'll end up stressing that element of the build more than a GPU with hardware acceleration in use. Turning on DLSS to the balanced preset didn't do much to improve either the average or the 1% low, further driving home that we're just CPU limited in the software title and this hardware. Don't get me wrong, this performance is great coming from the Xbox One and PS4 editions of the game, but it seems like the 120Hz mode on PS5 is technically the most stable way to experience this game, though I would still rather have a 9700K system over a PlayStation. Helldivers 2, another DirectX 12 based game, performed well on the 9700K once the GPU bottleneck was resolved by utilizing the upscaling feature in the game's settings. At the low preset with the balanced rendering upscaling, the 9700K was able to push 181 FPS on average, with the 1% lows coming in at 130. This game seems to be one of those titles that benefits from having a stronger CPU, but is primarily GPU limited. Once the GPU limits were out of the way, the 9700K was really able to stretch its legs a lot further than I thought I was going to be able to. There wasn't any noticeable stuttering in the gameplay, and while this is at the low graphics preset, things don't look super great, but it's definitely smooth on the eyes. The 9700K would pair decently with a higher end GPU in this title, but if you're spending this much on the graphics card, you'd probably want a newer and faster CPU as well. Up next is another Unreal Engine 5 title built on DirectX 12. And while it is pretty lightweight, it actually performs slightly worse than Helldivers. Marvel Rivals at the low graphics preset at 1080p was able to achieve 177 FPS on average, with the 1% low coming in at 123. Considering the tier of graphics card we're using in the system, we should be seeing higher performance, hinting at there being a pretty significant CPU bottleneck. During testing, the entire chip wasn't being slammed, but there were 2 or 3 cores that were sitting in the upper 90s in terms of total usage. Even if we had hyperthreading technology on this chip, I don't think it would help the performance of this game because we're just limited by the single core throughput. With something like an i5-12400, you'd see much better performance in a build using similar hardware, but considering what it's currently rocking, it's hard to say that it's running poorly on the 9700K. Minecraft Java Edition being tested in version 1.21.5, using the threaded rendering setting with a 16 chunk render and 8 chunk simulation distance. This game tests the single threaded throughput of CPUs because of how the rendering API is accessed and the general overhead of running inside a Java virtual machine. Achieving an average of 469 FPS at 4K, the performance of this title looks pretty hard to have issues with. But looking at the 1% low of 44, you start to get an impression that this game can run great a majority of the time but can still chug. This seems to happen most when you're flying above new generating chunks, which will stress almost any system to a similar extent. It just seems to be a fundamental limitation with Minecraft because of Java. Considering the DirectX version Bedrock performs so much better at the same render detail and simulation settings. The processor would be great to actually play Minecraft on or connect to a server with, but actually hosting a server, you'd probably be reaching the limits with what this chip could comfortably accomplish, as you probably wouldn't be able to play an instance of this game when running a server, like you might be able to get away with on a newer 13600K. Splitgate 2, another Unreal Engine 5 game. I'm noticing a ton of newer games are now being built on Unreal 5. And this one performed well when changing the graphics settings to stress the CPU. At the low preset with DLSS set to balanced at a final 1080p render resolution, the 9700K was able to push 262 FPS on average, with the 1% low coming in at 160. This is beyond competitively viable, and also looks very similar to the game at the highest settings, just with some lower resolution effects. Splitgate didn't seem to feature any shader compilation stutter that is becoming more common in other UE5 games like Fortnite, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't any slowdown. Things still hung out significantly above the 60 FPS mark, so I'm not saying that it was a bad experience, but you'd be able to beat this performance on a cheaper and newer Ryzen 5 5600 or i5-12400. The Coffee Lake R generation is the follow-up to the immensely popular Coffee Lake lineup that sported bangers like the i3-8100, i5-8400, and i7-9700k. Yet to differentiate this series from the old one, the specifications were adjusted on the i7, and an i9 tier was introduced with the fully unlocked die. Sporting an 8-core design with only 8 threads, this chip has a weird L3 cache configuration since part of it is disabled on certain cores, but it ultimately has the same last level cache capacity as to what's found in the 8700K. The 9700K, because it has more total cores, has more L1 and L2 cache than the 8700K. And since there aren't 2 threads sharing resources in each core, the single-threaded performance of this chip can theoretically be sustained for longer periods of time and may be slightly superior to chips featuring hyperthreading. However, a lot of software titles are starting to expect more threads along with a higher number of cores. So while the 9700K has 8 cores, the lack of 16 threads might pose some challenges when your system is running both the software and background OS tasks. For a lot of titles built with the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 generation of consoles in mind, 8 physical cores and 8 threads is more than enough to allow them to parallelize when they need to, and the Skylake microarchitecture has much stronger IPC than the Jaguar cores found in both flavors of the consoles. You kind of get the best of both worlds for gaming, but there are limitations when you start to utilize more threads in professional workloads. Things like light photo and video editing will run fine on this chip, but once you start to either drastically increase resolution or frame rates, the load placed on your system will likewise increase quite substantially, leaving me to want to recommend at least 16 total threads if you're wanting an 8-core CPU. In terms of motherboard compatibility, this chip works with any LGA 1151v2 socketed board, though Z370 and B360 boards will require a BIOS update if you want to ensure compatibility with any of the 9th gen parts. Any and all Z300 series chipsets, which includes both Z370 and Z390, are connected to the processor with a 4-lane DMI Gen 3 connection, which is perfectly adequate if you're connecting at most 2 NVMe drives to your chip, but you'll definitely start to lose some performance if you stress both of them at the same time. Most boards will end up routing one directly to the CPU, with additional drives daisy chaining off the chipset. You'll need to look at your specific motherboard and how it handles NVMe drives, because it's also possible that only one socket is NVMe compliant, with additional ones being wired with SATA instead. The boards the 9700K are compatible with were releasing right when NVMe drives were starting to become more popular, so while they might support at least one drive flawlessly, there might be issues you'll need to work around if you plan on utilizing multiple depending on the board you're using. These boards are also limited to PCIe Gen 3, which is still quick but falls behind when compared to newer Gen 4 based drives, and might not fully support newer PCIe protocols like resizable bar. The power limits of this chip out of the box come in at a hard 95 watt limit, with turbo boost allowing for the chip to increase power draw to around 125 watts for less than a minute at a time, before throttling back down to the out of the box TDP. This ends up causing the chip to behave in a very power limited fashion, but when idling or sitting at the desktop, you usually hang out between 30 to 60 watts, which is a lot compared to newer chips, but is well under the 95 watt TDP that's enforced by default. Going into the BIOS, and it was relatively easy for me to override these power targets, and I ended up allowing for the chip to max out at 255 watts for an unlimited period of time. As a result, the highest power draw I saw when running games was 202 watts, though that was not sustained. This caused the chip to overheat, though it wasn't throttling its clocks at all and was rock solid at 5 GHz. Because of the thermal concerns, for regular gaming I ended up limiting the chip to drawing 175 watts at most, and also allowed it to sustain that for an unlimited period of time. Once this limit was in place, the chip never went above 84 Celsius, which while still warm is a lot better, and keep in mind we're only testing with the 280mm AIO in this chip. Clocks on this CPU can sustain to 5 GHz, but the voltage can get kind of high at times. We're talking over 1.4 volts in an all-core sustained AVX workload. Voltage limiting the chip to 1.325 gave us a lot safer of a ceiling, but clocks suffered as a result.
The 9700K was able to hit 5 GHz, but once all the cores were loaded up, things would drop down to 4.9 GHz, which is still pretty hard to complain about. The all-core base clock of this chip is 3.6 GHz, with out-of-the-box behavior limiting the 4.9 GHz turbo boost to at most 2 cores at a time. You can unlock this by enabling multi-core enhancement in the BIOS, which will force all the cores to enable the turbo frequency. In terms of integrated graphics, the 9700K sports the Intel UHD 630 integrated graphics solution, which is pretty standard for a 14nm Skylake chip. You probably won't be playing games on it, but for basic connectivity and debugging, it's definitely a useful inclusion. If I had to sum up the 9700K, it would be one of a chip that's both enabled and limited by the technology available at the time. It's helped by the fact that 14nm+++ is a very popular and relatively inexpensive lithographic node, meaning tons of these chips were produced. As a result, you can pretty easily find a 9700K for around $140 on the used market. And for that price in 2025, you can get an i5-12400, which is on a more modern and feature-rich platform and will significantly outperform the 9700K that we've got here. This chip still comes with some downsides, primarily when it comes to power draw and multi-threaded performance. Skylake is still a great choice to use in 2025 though, as some sort of budget or second-hand system. And if I got my hands on one of these chips from someone in my family as a hand-me-down, I wouldn't complain at all because it's ultimately faster than the CPUs found in the consoles on a core-to-core basis. But it lacks the strong multi-threading capabilities commonly found in octa-core parts from both the red and blue team. As a result, if you want a game on this chip, it's an awesome choice, and it'll even work well for production workloads. But being realistic, I have to acknowledge that newer, similarly priced chips would outperform it in both areas. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. Let me know what you guys think about the 9700K. Is it worth considering for your workloads, or would a more modern LGA 1700 or 1851 chip ultimately be your preferred choice? That's all I really have to say on the matter. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.